this is the environment scene. And you can see here, I've added a particle system. By the way, you all may remember that I kept running into errors every time I played this file. And I finally just Googled the error that I was getting. And all I needed to do was, and the error was like something about the editor, but all I needed to do was go to layouts and reset it to the default layout. So that reset Unity, and then everything, it played fine. So if you run into that issue with this project, or any projects where you're getting an unclear error, the best thing to do is copy the error into your browser URL and do a search. And generally there's solutions out there. Most errors are errors that many other people have run into. So this, the file that we're looking at is this one, Skybox Terrain Demo with additions. I think the one that I loaded doesn't have the particle system, but it does have what I used to create the particle system. So let me play this first. So this is, if you all remember, this is the demo for the terrain that we built in class, and I added grass. I think I may have added palm trees just to see a different tree in place. But this is it's using the skybox from a couple weeks ago, and then the first player controller that comes with the Unity starter assets. So I'm gonna bounce out of that. So going back to the terrain and paint texture. So this terrain has 4 different textures applied to it. If you click on Edit Terrain, Create Layer, and you can think of it almost like Photoshop in that you're painting these different patterns onto the terrain object. And what if let me get out of maximize on play. So what we're seeing mostly here is the 3rd layer, but if let's see if I can climb up over. Let's move this spot. Well, I wanted to get up over to see the layer, the first layer, which is the rock layer. So if I look down on here, initially with this layering for a natural environment, I started off with the rock layer. Then I added a mountain layer. And then lastly, a moss layer. Or no, not lastly, a moss layer. And then at the top of the peaks, I added what is a snow layer. And get out of this. So in textures, you can see that there's a moss layer with a mask and the normal map. Then there's a snow one, snow also with a mask and normal. There's this one I did not name. I should. Well, the layers, when they're created, they're just named new layer. You could go back and name them appropriately. Like rock layer, add. snow layer. And then this is the moss layer it's based. Which I thought, although it's moss, I thought it worked nicely with making it look like there were figs and, you know, kind of a forestry space. So the grass, so I added trees, and there's two different types of trees. The conifer desktop and then a palm desktop tree. And these are all from the standard assets. So standard assets is an old collection of assets that were used for many years, but Unity stopped keeping it up to date. However, I downloaded just the environment folder because that environment folder comes with trees. It comes with terrain assets such as this grass, water, and there's a couple examples of water in there. So they're great as far as still being able to build an environment. It's not going to be like high definition, but it's a great to prototype, and actually you can build a perfectly good environment with it. So the trees, you can set the brush size, tree density. I added the grass that we see here. And so two things I want to include today are a particle system. So I already have one particle system, but I'll go ahead and turn that one off and recreate it. So in the hierarchy, I'm right-clicking, choosing particle system, and you can see that it immediately will open a pause, reset, stop panel where I can, you know, see how it plays back. And in the inspector, in the particle systems inspector, let's rename this, we'll call it fire. So in the particle system inspector, it's made up of a ton of properties: duration, looping, pre-warm, start delay, and then there's many more properties. So we see particle systems in animation and games all the time in order to create smoke or steam or sparks of electricity or fire. You can even use it to build out what's going to be an explosion. So there's lots of uses. And what I'm going to do here is directly from chapter 4 from the book Unity in Action that I provided for the class. I know most people are doing Create with Code from Unity Learn, but there's I think there's really great tutorials and great examples in Unity in Action as well, which is why I included in the class. So the author, the sprite that I brought in, this is an image that the author created in Photoshop, and I brought it in and set the textures type to sprite 2D and UI, and then created a new material. And that material, you have to set it to particles and standard unit. So any like if you create, say you go into Photoshop and you just create some, paint some white lines with different opacity and export them either as PNG, a transparent PNG. When you bring them into Unity, you'll want that PNG to be a sprite 2D UI, and then within Unity, create a new material, make sure that the shader for that material is set to particles and standard unlit or standard surface. You can look up either and to see the differences. For this fire effect, standard unlit is what's used. And then rendering mode additive. So these should be familiar from Photoshop. I mean, yeah, from Photoshop. And we know that, you know, if you make a layer additive, it kind of bounces the light that other layers present. So in Photoshop, it's about how layers interact with each other. Here, it's in Unity, it's about how light interacts with your particle system. So an additive one is going to give kind of a projection of, in this case, of this kind of yellow-orange that the original file is. And then color mode, multiply. So once you've set up your material and we go to the particle system, at the very bottom where it says render, you'll see that the material that's being applied is the default particle system. So it's just, this white dot. So one of the things I'm going to do is just go ahead and replace that material with the one that I created. And if we click play, well, we see it's not number one, it's growing from a cone shape, and there's not really any movement. So what we want to do is make some changes to how this particle system behaves. So the duration, I'll leave it at 5. I'll bring down the start lifetime to 3, and the start speed, I'll bring it down. I think in the book it has it at 1, but I'm gonna I like it at 0.6 because to me it looks a little bit more like fire. Start rotation, I'm gonna put it at 180 so that there is rotation as it moves. And then I'm going to change the start color to something that's more like an orange. Okay, it's fine. And as I'm applying these changes, you can see that they're added on the fly. So simulation space, I'm going to put it in the world. And local, checking my notes. Okay. So next I'm going to go, and these are the sort of default behaviors. Then there's a whole lot of other behaviors that you can add. So if I scroll down, emission, I'm going to change the 10, 0. Actually, that emission is fine. Just make sure it's on for this. The shape, instead of a cone, I'm going to use a box. And that will, because I want it to be sort of a flame that's, kind of held together. And I'm going to turn on size over lifetime. And here, here I can set this, and so I can use this Bezier line to set how it behaves over its lifetime, over its 6-second, I think, lifetime. And so I want it to start to move quickly and then to the height of its lifetime, and then slowly disappear. So I'm going to double click to add a new anchor and bring it up. And I want it to just go away at the end. So I'm going to take the last anchor and bring it down. And then I want this to move pretty quickly. So, okay, so this might, remind you of Illustrator and setting your Bezier curves in Illustrator. So this is just to create the shape of how the animation is going to play out and the lifetime of each one of these little flames. And rotation over lifetime, I'm going to turn that on. And I'm going to set it to random between two constants. I'll have it be -80 to 80. So again, all of this is covered in chapter 4 from Unity in Action, and I'm just borrowing directly from that. So render, I already changed. I left the render mode to billboard. You can see that there's stretch billboard, horizontal billboard, vertical billboard, mesh, none. So if I was doing something like steam rising from the land, I'd probably go with horizontal billboard, or smoke rising to the sky, maybe stretched billboard. This this works fine with this particular example, and I'm just going to move it. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Okay, if I threw down some lumber and put it on the ground, I think it would work fine for fire. It's a lot brighter than I really want it to be, so I might want to, all these settings you can play with, including the rendering mode. I think I do want it to be additive. Maybe, yeah, I want to leave that as additive. But maybe I'll make this a little bit darker. And all of these things, the best thing, there's so many that really the best thing is to, if you put your mouse over them, you get a description, but to sort of look them up. And of course, there's countless tutorials for creating smoke. Okay, that's a little better. It's not quite as white at the center as it was before. All right. We can look at the trees and they're pretty static. The grass has its own movement. So I'm going to add wind in order to make the trees a little bit more have them dance and just activate the space a little more. So I'm going to 3D object and choose wind zone. You can see as I pull it out that there's an arrow as to where the wind is directed. But it creates a swirl, so it affects everything around it. And you can see that there's main for overall strength of wind, turbulence, randomness and strength, pulse magnitude, strength of wind pulses, and pulse frequency of the wind pulses. All of these are, best to play around with, and there's directional or spherical to see its effect. So now that I've added a wind zone, let's see what effect it has. Okay, so you might want to, it seems, um, oh, it's affecting these guys too. So wind zones work particularly well with trees. Trees are built. Any tree that you download from the Unity store is going to have properties that work with the wind zone. And I can see the fire doesn't seem to be affected. So that's something that I'd want to see if within the particle systems settings, there's ways to have it react to the wind zone. Okay, I'll stop there. I was playing around. So this first person controller is the one from the Unity's starter kit that has built into it the Cinema Machine brain. And just a note on Cinema Machine, I don't have, well, right now I'm doing actually a tutorial, this Cinema Machine dolly cart and track, because I'm trying it out for a project that I'm working on, which will be more of a video project. So if you were creating, like, Cinema Machine came out of a lot of filmmakers and animators using Unity to create not interactive projects, but to create animated works. So, anyway, so I'm playing with it and trying to see what I can do with it. But one of the things you can do is like set up your own points that work as a dolly. So imagine the camera being on a track that moves around an environment. In my case, I'm setting it up so that the camera will revolve around a character to capture it in 360. But so this one, I was trying to figure out how to add a reticle to the first-person controller using this this FPC from Unity. And I bring it up because the next thing I'm going to talk about. But when I hit play, there's no reticle. But if I am gonna hit escape in order to pause the project, we see a reticle here. So this is not what I'm looking for. This is not how I'm trying to add a reticle. So I haven't figured out exactly how to add it to, I haven't figured out how to add it to this first person controller. What it should be a property that's tied to the camera. And I thought maybe this target texture would be what's used, but when I try to add it to it, it's not there. So I have to search around and figure that out. So the reason you're seeing that for the mouse is if I go to the build settings, or really I want to go into the player settings. If I go into the player settings, I changed the default cursor to this fire thing. But I'm pointing that out just because you're seeing it, but it's not how to add a reticle to this particular first-person controller. So I'm going to close this project, but before I do, any questions? I know I only made a few changes to the particle system, but you can see the primary thing, which is bringing in your own texture, creating a specific type of material, and then adding that material to the particle system, to the renderer, and then changing the settings and getting to know the settings. The best thing, like you could easily spend a day just playing around with the particle system and trying out all these different settings and seeing what they do in order to get effects. But Christy, when you talked about an environment that would have, you know, kind of these fantastical elements, I just thought particle system is a great way to sort of create, I don't know, something that's layered and could present a sense of magic through, you know, whether it's fireflies or haze or smoke or mist. Those would all be examples of maybe wanting to use the particle system. Okay, any questions?
I didn't have a question, but like, thank you for going through this. I have like some really good ideas now that kind of got like a walkthrough of it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, so I'm going to close out this project and move on to another one. And so Navmesh demo, the next thing I want to talk about is baking. So taking your environment and it can be applied to any environment that you want characters to move around in. So Unity introduced a nav mesh specifically for non-player characters that would be moving around an environment. So the characters that I used for this next demonstration are from Mixamo, and I downloaded a couple of characters with walk cycles. And I only downloaded them with walk animations in order to have them just walking around the space. So I want to demo spawning these characters and then having them walk from one place to another place using the Navmesh demo, or using the Navmesh and Navmesh agent. So there's the second bullet under today is this presentation in which first I'm going to talk about what I was just showing, this idea of the reticle, how you can use that to present a visual metaphor, and then move into demoing the Navmesh. So so this example is from a project that I had been working on. Rebecca, you're familiar with this project because you helped me install it last October. And it's a project in which I was thinking about finance and these new financial technologies that are coming out, and things like cryptocurrencies, which one of the things that came to mind is a black hole, because most people don't fully understand them or don't fully understand how they work and how they can be applied, but people are still investing in them. So because that's what I was thinking about and I was reading and trying to understand it, the idea of a black hole came to mind, and I started looking up at visualizations of black holes from 2018 were the first visualizations that were created from black hole data, and this is one of the images, and I decided to use this image in order to create an icon for the project. I applied it to, I conducted interviews with many people, from financial specialists to people buying into these things but not knowing what they were doing, to people working and using these new tools in different ways. So I also used it to create a logo, and then also a favicon. So the favicon, and if you've done web production, the little image that shows up at the top is Microsoft back in like 2000 came up with this term favicon and started using, where Explorer was the first company to use it. So design for reticle. So I went ahead and took that same concept and created this Illustrator file. So for reticles to work, they have to be square, and they can be 32 square pixels, anywhere from 32 to 64. It depends what you're looking for. 64 is probably a little big, but this, you can see in the properties, this is just a circle with this particular brush applied to it. And then a couple of different strokes, and there's two different layers with the same circle, but with two different brushes that are being layered and then exported as a PNG, as a transparent PNG, and imported into Unity. So I bring it up because as you create your projects, again, I'd like people to think about visual metaphors and how you can make the entire experience of the user in your project, even the reticle that they're looking at, something that is tied to the message or the type of environment or the sensibility or the emotions that your environment should generate in the user. Let's see. Okay, so this is the project that I uploaded, and hopefully people are going to follow along. You've downloaded, and you can see here that this is a 64 by 64 pixel PNG that I exported from that Illustrator file that I'm applying to the reticle, and it's being applied. In this case, I'm using another first person. And this one has actually, I'll show you the updated version, but you can see that there's, in the way it's scripted, in the first person AIO script, there's this crosshair, and you can apply your own reticle there. So this first person controller, let's see. Is from the updated version is Super Character Controller. It's free. It has all sorts of things built into it. And I decided, it seemed like some people were having, there might have been some errors from the Cinema Machine being exported as a package and people downloading them. So I decided, instead of reusing that FPC controller, that first person controller, trying this one. And again, this one, that if you guys downloaded this project, this is using an old version of it. I do have a new version of that same, using that super first person controller. And I haven't spent enough time with it to be sure that I'd want to use this, because it seems like there's some bugs with it. But if I open the camera settings, you can see here that there's now this crosshair sprite, and that's where you add in your own reticle, So if I play this, you can see what that looks like. And right now I've stopped. Oops. What I'm finding with it is that, so I'm using the arrows to walk around, but if I walk forward, I'm gonna walk forward and then stop. It just keeps on going. So that was not happening with the older version. So I'm sure there's a way, there's a setting that it comes with so many settings that there's a way to keep that from happening, but I haven't found where that setting was. So I'm sticking to the older version of it, but it's a very popular package. Let's see. you can see that it has 282, 3,635 people have favorited it and lots of ratings, and it's freely available. But like anything, you have to try the different settings, see what works, and figure it out. Okay, so here are a couple of different reticles that I've used for different projects, both created in Illustrator. Okay, so before I get into the Navmesh, I want to talk a little bit about the camera. So right now, let's close this. I just need one version of this open. So I have a few different cameras set up in this project. I'm going to turn off this first person, and I do have a main camera, which I have it set up from up here. You can see the main camera view here, and I have it set up in this way so we can see the non-player characters moving around the space. So at any point when, like, if you want to set up a different view of your project, you can select your camera and go to game object and align with view. So right now, if I play it, I have this view of it, but let's say I don't want to have it at this angle and want to switch it to this angle. I can just set up my main camera and go to game object and align with view. And you can see it now when I play it. This is the view that it's going to have. And if I built this out, whether to WebGL or desktop or what have you, this is the what people will be seeing. This is what the project will be. I bring it up for purposes of testing and trying different things. So there's one other camera, and this is a standard camera. It's not the Cinema Machine package camera, which has a whole lot more properties, but you can do some of the things that they built into the Cinema Machine just with a regular camera. So I have, is it in this character? So one of these characters, this is, again, a character from Mixamo. So this character has a camera also, and I'm going to turn that camera on. And in this case, the camera is set. You can see that the camera is nested to the character. And because it's nested to the character, and then also the camera position is turned around, and then on the X coordinate moved. So let's say that this Mixamo character is set at the 0, 0, 0 coordinates. That's the starting point of every child element to this character. It's tied, when I add a camera and it's nested, say I go to, click on the character and create a camera, it's going to be nested right inside, like at the center of the game object that the camera is being nested to. So 1.5, it's a little bit higher, and then 2 on the Z coordinates, so like 6 feet away from it, because we're talking meters. And there's a 15 there's a rotation of 15 on the X and 180. So that's turned around. And rather than the camera looking out from the character, it's turned around and looking at the character. So with this camera on, if I turn on the project, I'm just gonna follow the character. And the character is being spawned. So it's a prefab that's being spawned from this cube or from this other game object. It doesn't have to be a cube. It could be an invisible, or it could be a door. It could be an invisible game object. And the camera is just following them along. So I could go ahead and, again, build this out, and this would be the view of the entire project. So the reason I'm talking about all this is just the fact that you can use camera in many different ways, even the default main camera. And once I spend more time with the cinema machine, I can describe different ways of using all the properties that camera system comes with. Okay, so now getting specifically into Navmesh, I want to talk about what that is. So Unity comes with an AI module that implements the pathfinding features in Unity. Two key components of the AI module are the Navmesh with its building components and Navmesh agents. Together, they present a powerful system to get non-player characters moving around. So we're going to create a navigable environment, for example, made of a ground, game objects, and walls, or a path. It's simplest to group your navigable environment. So putting grounds and walls into one empty game object. This way you can select the game object with all its children to bake the Navmesh. So I'm gonna create a new scene. So I'm gonna go into scenes, and I'm gonna create a new scene, and I'll call it demo. And go into it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create an empty game object. I'll call it maze. And in it, I'll create a cube. So I'll make this cube, I'll call it ground. And I'll scale it. Start with 10. I'll leave it 1 on the Y and 10 on the Z. And in the assets, there's a few materials. So these materials are just default materials, but I changed, like I went into create material, and say this one's yellow, and then just changed the color. So I'm sure everybody knows how to do this, but I'll go ahead and add this material to my ground. I'll use brown to add it to my ground. And I'm going to take a bird's eye view. So let's see. I have some characters, and again, these characters are from Mixamo. So I'll put one here. Okay, so this ground, maybe I'm going to scale it up a little bit more. Instead of 10 by 10, I'll have it be 15, maybe even 20 by 20. Okay, so now I'm gonna add some walls. And make sure it's not buried. So I'll make it 10. On the Y, I'll make it pretty tall, 5. And I'll leave it as 1 on the Z. So let's see what that's looking like. Okay, that's fine. But I don't want it halfway into the ground. Twos. Looks like 3 is puts it right on the wall, right on the ground. Okay, so I'm gonna, for my materials, I'll just give it a blue. So I'm gonna duplicate this wall just to create a sort of maze. Okay, I'll start with 5. Okay, just a very basic environment, but something that can be navigated. Now that I think about it. Make them all 15. And they probably really don't need to be quite this tall, but that's fine. Okay, so the Navmesh is made up of a few different things. Agents, movement controlled by Navmesh. So an agent has 4 main properties to assign size and moving abilities used by Navmesh to decide where they can and can't go. The size of the agent is configured by a cylinder that reflects the width, radius, and height of your character. You can decide on the height of steps accessible by the character and the gradient of slopes. Humanoid is the default agent. However, you can add more agent types for different scales of your characters. And right now I'm reading from my notes. I linked to the Unity documentation for each one of these from the presentation. So you can see that there's kind of a cylinder shape applied to Navmesh agents. Areas. Area tab is used to define different costs for different areas. For example, water or mud could have a higher cost than 1 or 2. For example, if you set the cost of an area to 3, traveling across that area is considered to be 3 times longer than alternative routes. The cost is used by the AI to determine the fastest path to an endpoint. Any area part can be included or excluded from the mesh. The area types are specified in the navigation Windows areas tabs, and there are 3 built-in types: walkable, not walkable, and jump. There are up to 29 customizable types. Again, you can read more on on these on each one of these different properties that you can add to the Navmesh. And Bake tab uses that baked agent size to determine navigable area. Not the agents that you set up in the agent tabs. Humanoid is the only agent type defined in the Navmesh itself. There is an advanced voxel data structure used to divide the world up before Navmesh is constructed. The bigger the voxel size, the less details in the Navmesh. Minimum region area should be between 2 and 4. Make it higher to remove unwanted areas of the Navmesh. And then the object tab used to select areas that should or should not be part of the Navmesh. Okay, so again, this is all about thinking about applying a Navmesh to your environment so that you can have non-player characters moving independently and taking advantage of the artificial intelligence that's built into Unity. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, so in order to use it, we're going to go to Window, AI, and Open Navigation. And here you can see the different things that I just mentioned, agents, the default humanoid agent. You can add more. So like I created, this is inspired by the Margaret Atwood novels. She made a trilogy of sci-fi end of the world set of novels in the early 2000s. This is the same author who wrote The Handmaid's Tale. That was a really popular Netflix show. Anyway, I think it's Onyx and Cork, the trilogy that I'm talking about from the early 2000s, she introduces this idea of the Pagoon, which we've recently seen become a reality. In her stories, the Pagoon are biologically manipulated pigs. Like if you're super wealthy and you want to have backup organs for yourself, you can hire this company to take material from your body to create like a heart or lungs, and they're all from your own body, and they're all stored in these giant pigs. And so she took pig and balloon, and actually they're called Pagoons, not Pagoons. And recently we saw a surgery in which a heart that was stored, a human heart stored in a pig, was placed in a human being, and that person survived for a few weeks. It was considered a successful surgery. So you can see that the radius, so the humanoid by default has a radius of 0.5, a height of 2, or approximately 2 meters, 6 feet, step height of 0.75, and then there's a max slope. And all of this you can change to define how much what's climbable, what in the environment the user can access, or not the users, the characters can access. Whereas with the Pagoon, there's it's much wider. So in another example, say you're creating a project that's going to have giants, and the giants can't get through a specific area, then you could have its radius be wider than the radius in between a set of walls, or between a set of buildings. And change also height. Maybe they can't get into like a tunnel, step height, max slope, all of these things can be set so that it makes them difficult. One of the things so step height, it's 0.75 by default in the humanoid, whereas the step height for the Pagoon, the max is 0.2. So in Atwood stories, the Pagoons become hunters of humans once everything's gone haywire. And they're really smart and they work in packs, but they're so big that they're not able to get upstairs. So the way that the characters survive are always by running upstairs when they're being hunted by Pagoons. Areas. So I mentioned that, you could imagine mud. You can have a specific element assigned to, if I added water or something that was going to have a different property, you can give it its own name and then give it a much higher number, making it more costly for the agent to move through that. So the AI will figure out a different path in order to get to where it's trying to get to. Okay, so this is what's going to be baked in the environment itself, and the settings for the environment as it gets baked. I mentioned this voxels. Again, data structure used to divide the world up before Navmesh is constructed. The bigger the voxel size, the less details in the mesh. Minimum region area should be between 2 and 4. Make it higher to remove unwanted areas of the nav mesh. And then let's see. We're going to want everything to be static. So if I go to the maze and the inspector, I put everything in one, everything that I want to be my navigable environment into this empty game object that I made, that I named a maze. And that's where I put the ground and the walls. So I'm selecting it because my entire environment is there. And I'm going to set it to navigation static. And yes, I want to change the children. I want everything to be navigation static. Save that. And now I can go to the bake. And so what you can see here is that there's this nav mesh display. This panel is turned on, show nav mesh. You can turn on show nav mesh height. And what you see is that it's the non-player characters are going to avoid the edges. And as they move around the space, they will, zigzag around these walls. And I placed this Mixamo there strategically just to be able to see if what I'm doing in here is going to be wide enough for the character to move around. If I were to create, let's say, create another cube. And I'll put it, let me bump it up a little bit. So whenever I add new elements to my environment, if I want it to be part of the world that should be baked into it, I want to make sure that navigation static is set in the inspector as the property of this new object. And if I don't want it to be walkable, so say, I don't know, say you're creating like a zone that for whatever reason you don't want the NPC players to move across it. You can have it be walkable, not walkable, jump, or mud. And mud is only here because in the areas I created, so say instead of mud, we'll put quicksand. And give it a cost of 100. Now, when I go to navigation area, it's incorporated into my Navmesh. And you can see that I just added quicksand. It's going to be really costly. So the NPCs are most likely to avoid it if they can. So that cube, I'll say it's not walkable, or you can use quicksand. And now, if I want to include it, I'll go ahead and select the game object that holds all of this environment and click bake. So now the cube has been incorporated and the path kind of lifts over it. So there's a little bit of a lift there. Okay. These are the basics of the Navmesh. We're going to do the Navmesh agent next. But, you know, again, the summary of it is go ahead and create an empty game object to hold your entire environment, have all the elements of your environment be parented to that empty game object. And you will need to make sure that in the inspector, for everything holding on your environment is set to navigation static. And then, you know, you saw that pop-up window asking if you want all the child elements, game objects to also have that same navigation static set, and say yes. And then everything having to do with setting up a Navmesh is under Window, AI, Navigation. And so it, by default, I have this set to default panels, so it opens next to Inspector, and it's made up of agents, areas that can have different costs. The bake, where you actually bake, the AI will study the environment that you've created, and according to these settings, will generate possible paths that that your non-player characters will take. And you can see that there's also a terrain button. So if you're applying it to terrain, so the object that this is being applied to. Before switching to Navmesh agents, any questions? Also, you guys can ask, like, why are we doing this? Why are you covering this? And I did, under today's date in the presentation, there is building a Navmesh that walks, this is the next slide after the agents, areas, bake, and object. Object tab should use to select areas that should or should not be part of the Navmesh. So building Navmesh. And so it walks you through all of this. And just to go over, so Window, AI, Navigation. To open it up, select scene geometry that should affect the navigation, walkable surface, and obstacles. 3, the inspector, or in the navigation window, object tab, check navigation static on to include selected objects in the Navmesh baking process. And here you can see all is selected. Adjust the bake settings to match your agent size. Baked agent size allows you to customize what is navigable and what is not. How wide the agent, that is the game objects that are able to navigate the area. If the agent radius is wider than an opening, they can't move through it. The height of the agent default is 2 meters, about 6 feet. Max slope of the hills it can walk up. If a hill has too steep an angle above the angle you set, it can't walk up that slope. Step height, how tall walkable step area are step heights that they can climb, the angles. Any changes to your environment require rebaking the nav mesh for your environment. Agent radius defines how close the agent center can get to a wall or a ledge. And that's why we see the spacing on the ledge of the path, on the edge of the paths. Agent height defines how low the spaces are that the agent can reach. Max slope defines how steep the ramps are that the agent walk up. Step height defines how high obstructions are that the agent can step on. And then click bake to build a nav mesh. So next, making game objects into nav mesh agents. Select your game objects that will be maintained within the nav mesh. In its inspector, create the tag AI and give the game object that tag. Add component nav mesh agent, experiment with customizable elements of the agent, such as change speed to 10. And we already have, so actually before that, so any questions about using Navmesh on your environment? Feel free to, turn on your mics if you have questions. Thumbs up from Christy. Anybody else? Okay, so all's good. All right, great. Okay, cool. So let's keep going. So I do have, I mentioned that these came from Mixamo, and these are already I already set them up, but something that you may run into if you do pull characters from Mixamo is that the textures aren't being applied. The textures of the materials aren't being applied. So I have a characters folder here, and when I first brought these in, everything came everything came packaged, including animations, and if I exported it as an animation or avatars, it all came across. But what I found was that the textures weren't being applied, and they were just kind of grayscale. So what I had to do is select the character and its inspectors. I went to the materials tab and I extracted texture. It'll ask where you want the textures, and it should be just in the folder where the character is. And the normal maps always have to come over as normal maps, but so Unity will see that the normal maps haven't been texture type hasn't been set to normal map, and it'll say, do you want that fixed? And just click yes. And then we have to extract the materials. So if you pull these characters and you try using them, but you see that their materials aren't being applied, this is what you need to do. You need to select it, go to the inspector, go to the materials tab, extract textures, extract materials. Then also in the rig tab, set animation type humanoid right here. Avatar definition, create from this model, and click apply. So avatar definition, create from this model, and click apply. And now it'll be ready to be added to the hierarchy. I click it. So when we did the AR project, you all may remember that I found this low poly trump and then used Mixamo to set the joints and then apply different animations. So what some of these characters will have animations packaged in them. So like this one, I have I downloaded, oh, you want. So this character, yeah, chapter 7, I downloaded with a walking animation. And you may remember that Command D is to export that animation. And I already have it here, but it just exported walking 1. So when I create an animation controller, so if you all remember, create and go to animation controller, and I'll call this demo. And if I double click, we get this, this graph where I can apply my different animations. So I just pulled out this animation. And so if I apply, I'm going to want this to be loop time and loop post, because in this case, characters to constantly be walking. So as soon as this character is set into the environment, it's automatically going to be in this walk cycle, which you can test here. So hopefully you guys remember some of the, remember this, or you've covered it in Create with Code. And so then we can start adding. So once this character doesn't have a controller, I have this characters folder and I just dragged it in here just to see the scale of the environment that I was assembling. So I just created a character controller and I can go ahead and apply it to a character. I haven't set the camera, so let's go. I'm going to set the main camera, and all right, so if I go to game object, align with view, I just want to see that this character is animated according to the animator controller that I set it to, and it is. Okay, so she's walking along. So right now I haven't told her that she's an agent of the Navmesh, that she's going to follow the Navmesh that I've added to this environment. But before doing that, I just wanted to point out that this issue that I ran into with the Mixamo characters, that the materials and textures weren't being applied. And also remind you how to unpack the animations that you may have downloaded from Mixamo if you use Mixamo, and that Command D or Control D on the PC are the ways to extract the animation. And then to make sure if they're going to be the same animation that's loops, such as the walk cycle, to loop time and loop pose in the animation itself. So I did it by double clicking it in the animation controller, but you can just as well just click the animation itself in your assets and set the loop time and loop pose. All right, so I'm looking at my notes. So I'm going to select my character, and I already have, so there's tags that can be used, and the tags are really useful because say there's I don't know, an area that destroys your character, but you don't want it destroying the player. You just want it destroying specifically a set of characters. You can create a tag and using a script to destroy specifically those characters, target them by their tag. So I made up, you can add tags. And you can see that there's this AI tag. So that was one that I added. You can add however many tags as you want. And so this character, I'll give it the tag AI just because it's part of Unity's artificial intelligence system. And I'm going to add the Navmesh component. So as soon as I type in an A, Navmesh agent becomes available. There's Navmesh obstacles. Navwalk is, it's a script that I made. First person AI is from that downloaded package for the first person player. So I'm going to choose Navmesh agent. And yes, I want it to be a humanoid. I could have be a Pagoon, but I want it to be a humanoid. And you can change the speed. You know, instead of 3.5, you could have it walk a lot faster. And so now I'm not telling it to go from any one point to any other point. So yeah, so I'm kind of curious to see what happens if I don't tell it where to go. Hit play. Probably just, yeah, it just stays in place. It'll follow the nav mesh, but only if it's being directed in some direction. So, but it's set up to move through the space. Okay, now there's a bunch of, I'm going to go into my scripts folder. And there's a handful of scripts here that that I've added: agent control, destroy object, navwalk. This is open close. This is to create doors. And this is from the Unity in Action book. And then there's the scripts. And this is to generate and then I can use code to generate new versions of the character. So just to look at these, agent control, destroy object, navwalk, and spawn. So using Unity Engine, and I need to add for anything that's going to use the Navmesh AI, I have to call in this namespace. So using Unity Engine.ai. So .ai, so these are what are referred to as namespaces, which are a specific set of subclasses of the Unity engine. So I'm calling in a whole set of classes that will allow me to tell how this character acts. Agent control is just a name that I gave this C# file. There's a public variable and public transform home. This is the target where I want it to go to. And then what this is being applied to is going to be the character itself, Navmesh agent. Use the Navmesh component that's using that has the Navmesh applied to it. And then start is called before the first frame update. So agent is this. So I'm going to take this agent control script and apply it to my character. And so it's being applied to itself, get component, Navmesh agent. Again, this is part of the AI namespace. And then agent set destination. What is that destination is going to be home. Home is a public variable. So when I select whatever's holding this script and look at the inspector is going to have a field that's going to be the home and say, I want it to go to a particular building, or I want it to go to any game object that is set in my environment. Then I can pull it into that field, and that's where it's going to be directed. That's where it's going to walk to. Navwalk.cs, again, the AI namespace has to be included. Public transform target, void start navmesh agent equals get component navmesh agent dot destination target position. And we're going to look at these. So I mentioned destroying. So if you're spawning, say you've written a spawn script that is spawning. So in this case, they're going to be spawned initially every 3 seconds, and then a new one will be spawned randomly over a range. Next agent will spawn, in this case, 10 to 40 seconds, so not 2 to 5 seconds. If we set that a lot lower, there's going to be a lot more of them. So this, well, first I'll mention destroy object. So you can see if other tag is AI. So I created a tag AI and I assigned it in the inspector, assigned it to the character. When it collides with any game object that has this destroy object applied to it, then that character will be destroyed from the game. So it'll be erased from the hierarchy. Okay, I'm going to jump over to the scene where I have everything set up so I can walk you through it in action. Okay. So before I do this, let's take a 10-minute break. I'm gonna pause. All right, so we have the Navmesh set up. We've got this environment, we've got this character, but with a character animator and a Navmesh agent component applied to her, but she's not moving. She's not going anywhere. So if I go to my scripts and so agent control, this is the one that I want applied. So I'm going to go ahead and add component, or I can just drag the script to my character. And I can see in the inspector that there's the agent control has been added. And there's that public variable home. So I'm just going to add another game object here, and I'll have it be a sphere, 3D object sphere. We'll put it at the end, toward the end of my Navmesh. I'll call it, could call it home. And now, before I apply it, I'm just going to save. I'm not sure what view do we have, the main camera view. Oh. I'm getting an error because I have that variable and it's empty. Okay, so I'm gonna drag my sphere into home. And now the agent should have somewhere to go. And remember, the maze is set up if I select it and clear this. If I what am I not seeing? What I want to see is, oh, I'm not in the scene. So if I remember, there's this cube here, and it should affect the agent when it moves along this nav mesh. Okay, it should work now. Let's see. Okay, good. So you may have noticed that the agent slows down when it gets over this area. And I expect it's because of the slope. It's a combination of slope and that that cube. I think it has the quicksand applied to it. Yeah, so that navigation area has the quicksand applied to it. That comes at a cost, so it slows. I'm curious now, if I change it to not quicksand and just walkable and rebake it. If it affects the speed, like it really slowed down when it got there, so. Yeah. It slowed down slightly, but not nearly as much. So I'm going to keep that cube as quicksand and rebake it. And every time I rebake, it kind of creates new. Let's see if we can visually see it reflected on cube, object, walkable. Yeah, so the polygons, there was a higher slope. It acted a lot different. So that affects how quickly the agent can walk across it. Okay, so now that it's an agent of the nav mesh, I can, let's put her somewhere else, and I'll change the home just for the sake of example. So I'd probably would want to play with things like the speed, make it look nice and natural. So yeah, it's always just going to go to home base. Okay, great. I'm going to switch over to scene and walk through what I set up as far as spawning agents. Basic nav. Okay. So I'm in the scene that came already with a project, and if you downloaded it. And in this project, there's prefabs folder. And in the prefab are the 3 Mixamo characters, the one we've been seeing. So each of these comes with an agent control script. And once again, prefabs, you can build them out in your hierarchy, add like anything like the Navmesh agent and the agent control, add any components you want to it, and then drag it into your assets folder. It's a good idea to create a prefabs folder in your assets folder and put them all in one place. Then when you bring them into the world that you're building, you can add, if you want the base or the home base to be different for different versions of that prefab, you just add it in the hierarchy. So this chapter 07, non-PBR walking, it's over here, and there is a red base at the opposite end of this. And it's just a cube. It's just a cube with the red material added to it. So that character is going to go from there to there. Then similarly, this other character that's at this end will go to this blue base. So again, all I did was create the bases in the hierarchy and then added them to that agent. Then there's one other one. I think this is the one that has, this is the one that has a camera that's being spawned. So there's these 3 characters, there's the 2 bases, and this is exactly like we saw in the demo with the demo scene. It's just more of them, but they're all doing what I just demoed. And there's 2 bases instead of 1. But then there's this character spawn. So this is a cube. It doesn't have to be a cube. It could be like an empty game object. It could be, an empty game object that has the spawn script attached to it. So there's this N agent that is, so it has 2 public variables, an agent and target object. If I go to the script itself, so it's just using the basic Unity engine. Spawn is the name of the script. There's 2 public variables. They're game object types, so they're not floating. They're not numbers like you would use on the score, but actual game objects that you drag from the hierarchy into the fields. Nav agent, an agent, and then target object. So void start 3, invoke spawn agent, and this is invoked at 3 seconds. Then there's void spawn agent, so a new function. And so I'm not using the update. I'm making up this new name for a function, game object NA, game object instantiate an agent. This is that one. This transform dot position, quaternion identity. So quaternion is that it's going to turn in a specific direction. and then invoke spawn agent random range 2 to 5. So every 2 to 5 seconds, a new agent will be generated. And so that script is applied to this cube, and it's from that cube that we should see duplicates of Mixamo Joe, because I pulled it from here into here, and it's going to want to know what its target object is. So it's they're all going to the blue base. Okay, let me see this working. So you can see that if I counted as soon as 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1, okay. Maybe I was counting too fast. But if I change that so that there isn't so many of them being generated, you can see it in the hierarchy when you're testing a project, or all the game objects. Game objects will always be represented in the hierarchy, even if they're a clone of or an instantiation of a game object. And you can see them all accumulating over here. So let's make it a much broader range, actually 2 to 30 seconds. And so it'll be a lot more sporadic. So you can imagine, like in your environment, if, let's say, I don't know, birds or rats, or depending on what your environment is, you can think about it becoming a much richer environment if these characters, if these elements are being generated and are animated across your environment. So then it just activates the space. So it's not just, so it's not just an environment that is, whether it's, an industrial environment or a forest or such a natural environment, is by adding these elements. So the things that I've been trying to demo with this project is you can do things from taking a skybox and adding a light that shows, the sunrise to sunset, to a skybox that rotates so the sky slowly moves, using the terrain tools to build out a natural environment. In that natural environment, if you downloaded a package of, say, a city package, you can start adding buildings. You can put the terrain and the buildings, and if you do sidewalks, all into one game object and generate a Navmesh. So then you can add agents that have their own artificial intelligence. They're going from one point to another point and activating the space to make it a much richer space. So if I imagine, if you create this project and instead of having camera with a bird's eye view, but you use one of the first person controllers, whether it's the one from the Unity starter kit or this super controller that's free, that independent developers created, we can, be placed within this world and, investigate it. I'm just looking for both. Actually, I think I'll get to one of the bases. So we've got this base, and there's 2 versions of this character in the hierarchy. And oh yeah, there's also this pill that was that has the same script of and is part of the Navmesh. What So those aren't being generated. They were just two placed randomly in the environment and they all get to home base. But on the other end, there's a collection. And I think if I were to build this out for anything other than demo, I'd make these bigger, more like 1.5 in scale. Because they feel, my camera is set in a way that I feel a little giant to them. Okay, so if rather than having them accumulate, and I was testing that script and it wasn't working, so I'm gonna have to figure out why it's not working to destroy it, but I still want to mention it because the concept is that I could have this destroy object and the script should target the AI if other dot tag is the same as AI, destroy other game object. But you saw for yourselves, they're not being destroyed. So I'm not sure, this is a script I've used many times. I'm not sure why it's not working. So I'll share it with everybody once I figure out why it's not working. Let's see, I'm trying if there's anything else in here that I wanted to. I think that's all I wanted to present for today. And I'm gonna pause the recording in case I think of something else.